It was just past 3. That hour when time feels suspended, stretched thin and brittle like old wire. The kind of hour when soldiers on night shift stop checking their watches because it only makes the minutes crawl slower. The desert had gone silent again. Not just quiet, dead. The kind of silence that presses in on your ears until you start hearing your own pulse, like a slow drumbeat inside your skull. Uriah had just his grip on the mounted M240B, one gloved hand resting near the trigger assembly, the other tracing slow, repetitive arcs along the ammo belt. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just watching, scanning the hazy perimeter where tan earth met black sky. Night vision goggles painted the world in sickly green tones, but after a while, even that started to fade into abstraction. Post Hotel wasn't special, just another guard post wrapped in HESCO barriers and sandbags, but something about it felt different. Maybe it was the way the floodlights cast strange, angular shadows against the barriers. Maybe it was the history, the ANA truck crash, the story everyone heard but nobody told twice. Or maybe it was just the fatigue. The kind that doesn't just blur your thoughts, but rearranges them into something quieter, less trustworthy. Then came the sound. A single, metallic thunk. Sharp, deliberate. As if a length of pipe had been swung full force into one of the support beams of the tower. Uriah froze. His breath caught halfway up his chest. He turned, eyes narrowing, trying to isolate the direction, but everything around him stood still. The lights hummed. The desert whispered. The sound didn't repeat. "Did you hear that?" He asked over his shoulder, his voice a low rasp, barely audible over the static of their side-channel radio. His partner, Williams, sat up slowly from his prone position against the wall. He was half awake, eyes squinting beneath his helmet, trying to decipher whether this was a joke, a threat, or something else entirely. Hear what? Thunk. This time, it was louder. Closer. Uriah could feel the vibration in the metal floor beneath his boots. He stepped away from the machine gun, peering over the edge of the platform. Nothing moved. The base was still, the Afghan compound beyond even stiller. "Check below," Uriah said, more in order than a suggestion. Williams grabbed his rifle, clicked on the flashlight, and descended the stairs. His steps echoed hollow against the steel, each one carrying more urgency than the last. Uriah waited. He strained to hear the whisper of sand, the brush of wind, the subtle scurry of an animal. But there was nothing. Just the electric buzz of the tower light and the weight of something unseen pressing into his spine. Williams came back up 10 minutes later, face pale beneath his gear. "Nothing," he said. "No prints, no movement. Nothing." Uriah didn't answer. He was staring at the HESCO wall where the ANA truck had hit, months ago. The metal was still torn there, no one had bothered to patch it. He had glanced that way a dozen times earlier in the night, but now something held his gaze. There were shadows. 2 of them. Side by side. Perfectly still. Not cast from the light behind them, these things were the shadow. Dense. Human-shaped. One taller than the other. Positioned exactly where the truck had struck. They weren't flickering or stretching like the others. They weren't fading with the floodlight's reach. They just stood there. Still. Watching. "Hey, hey, come here," Uriah said, gesturing urgently to Williams. "You see that?" Williams leaned over, adjusted his NVGs. Then froze. "Yeah," he whispered. Both men stared. Neither spoke. The figures didn't move. Didn't waver. After a long moment, Williams aimed his flashlight and switched it on, directly at the figures. They remained. No shadows should stay like that under direct light. And yet, they did, clearer now, but no less wrong. "What the hell?" Williams said, stepping back instinctively. That's not normal." Uriah swallowed hard, feeling his pulse beat against his throat. No. It's not. Then the figures began to move. Not walk. Not shift. They glided. Smooth and slow, like oil spreading across the ground. Side by side, they drifted left, toward the deeper shadow cast by an idle ANA vehicle. They didn't bounce. Didn't shift weight. Just moved. And then they were gone. Uriah's radio crackled to life with soft chatter from another post. Someone asked if they'd seen movement on their side of the perimeter. The voice was casual, but the question wasn't. Uriah hesitated, thumb hovering over the comms button. He didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back against the wall, stared into the dark where the shadows had been, and tried to name the feeling rising in his chest. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was colder. Older. Like something from a half-remembered dream that didn't fade with the morning. He looked at his watch. 3:15 exactly. He didn't know why that mattered. Not yet. They called it the smoke pit. Not because it was anything formal, no signpost, no designation on the map, but because that's what it was. A sun-scorched circle of packed dirt behind the motor pool, littered with the butts of hundreds of cigarettes and the blackened remnants of burned barrels. To someone passing through, it looked like nothing. Just a place to kill time and lungs. But to the men and women who gathered there between rotations, it was something else. A confessional. A liminal space. In the military, you're taught early on that there are places for jokes, and places for silence. There's a way you're supposed to carry yourself, a kind of steel spine and squared jaw that doesn't allow room for superstition. But out there, especially on the long nights and the longer deployments, the rules shift. And in the smoke pit, the stories start to bleed through the cracks. The smoke pit is where you find out what really happened on that last op. Not the polished version your command briefed, but the one with the details too strange to make sense. It's where Marines trade rumors like currency, swapping half-remembered encounters and whispered legends that follow units across continents. Sometimes it's about locals. Sometimes it's about things that can't be explained by locals, or by anyone. It's not a place for judgment. It's a place where things that don't make it into reports are spoken aloud, because silence starts to fester if you don't drain it. Ghosts don't like to be ignored. That's where this story starts, not in a firefight or a command tent, but there, in that low, dirty circle under the stars, where soldiers flicked ash into the desert wind and spoke in the half-laughing, half-nervous tones of people who've seen too much and know better than to say it out loud anywhere else. Chris was the first to speak. He was Canadian Army, built like a shovel handle, tall and lean, with a voice that carried the clipped edge of someone who didn't bother wasting words. Had served during Operation Athena, the Canadian contribution to the ISAF mission in Afghanistan. Kandahar Province, wintertime, late 2000s. Dry riverbed, he said, lighting another cigarette with the nub of the last one. About a half-click wide. We were sweeping through villages near the Argundab. 4-day op. Nothing unusual at first. You could tell by the way he spoke that he didn't like telling this story. Not because it scared him, he didn't scare easy, but because it lingered. Like smoke that clung to your uniform no matter how many times you washed it. He explained how the vehicles had been arranged in a big circle, standard procedure for overnight halts. LAVs and leopards facing outward, weapons trained on the endless dust in every direction. Fighting vehicles on perimeter duty rotated shifts throughout the night. Sleep in slivers, wake to tension. That's how it went. There's comfort in that, he said. Knowing the next guy's watching when you're out cold. But that night, I don't know. Something was off. He didn't elaborate, not yet. The smoke pit has its own rhythm. You don't rush the beat. Then came Sector SOS. He was American Army, eyes tired but alert, always scanning, like even in the safety of home, he was still pulling security. He didn't give his real name, just his online handle. Said it felt safer that way. Said his story had followed him longer than his unit had. His tale came from Kunar province. High mountains. Rough terrain. Remote observation post with a view over a dusty road that twisted down into a valley. He and 2 others had been watching through NVGs when they saw a boy leading goats, a common enough sight, except when one of them pulled off his goggles and realized something was wrong. Kid wasn't there, he said quietly. The goats were. You could see them with the naked eye. But the boy only showed up through night vision. The pit fell silent for a second. Not because they didn't believe him, but because too many had seen things like that, or heard about them from someone they trusted. And once you hear it, you start to look for it. Uriah's voice came next. Softer than the others. Not weak, just worn. Like riverstone, smooth from time and pressure. Had been stationed at Camp Dwyer in Helmand Province in 2011. A perimeter post near the Afghan National Army's compound. He didn't start with the shadows or the sounds. He started with the crash. 2 ANA soldiers in a truck rolled it into the HESCO wall right near his guard post. Both died. The barrier was never repaired. I always figured that kind of thing leaves an echo, he said. Not a haunting, not exactly. Just something that doesn't move on. Had worked the night shift there. Post hotel. Said they used a secondary radio channel for casual chatter between towers, keeps you awake, keeps you sane. But even over the banter, there were things you couldn't ignore. Footsteps on metal stairs when no one was there. Shadows standing still against floodlight, not cast from anything real. He said the first time he saw them, he called his partner over. 2 silhouettes, side by side. Too defined. Too still. Should have vanished when we hit them with light, he murmured. They didn't. Another long pull from a cigarette. A pause. Nobody rushed him. Next night, we swapped guys on duty. Let someone else see it too. Thought maybe we were losing it. But they weren't. The new guys saw it too. Then they heard the banging, like something striking the tower supports from underneath. And when their corporal brought fresh batteries, Williams, the second guy, asked who had been walking up behind him. There was no one behind me, the corporal said. That was when Williams went pale. Uriah said he'd never seen a man's skin drain color that fast. You can laugh if you want, he added. I probably would have too, if it hadn't followed me home. He meant that literally. Even back in the States, something didn't feel right. Shoes moved during the night. Rooms felt occupied when they weren't. And always, that feeling that someone stood just outside the corner of your vision, waiting. Uriah wasn't trying to convince anyone. None of them were. That's not what the smoke pit was for. It was a place to speak. And maybe, in the spaces between words, to find someone who'd seen it too. Felt it. Survived it. Because out there, in those far-off deserts where time folds in on itself and silence goes deep, the rules don't always hold. You can have all the gear, all the training, all the firepower, and it still won't matter when something old, and patient, and unseen decides to sit beside you in the dark. And sometimes, it doesn't leave when you do. It began the way most strange things do in war zones, not with screams or sirens, but with something quiet. Subtle. Almost forgettable. Chris remembered the sound first. A soft, irregular thump against the armored hull of the LAV. Not loud enough to startle him outright. Just enough to register in that half-awake state where instincts have to work harder than eyes. It was the kind of sound that, in a place like Kandahar, triggered a full-body alert. A kind of creeping awareness that pulsed from spine to skin. They were camped for the night in the middle of a dry riverbed, wide and exposed, with nowhere to hide and nothing for miles but dirt and sky. It was standard operating logic, visibility equals security. You could see anyone coming from hundreds of meters away. But on that night, visibility meant nothing. Chris lay stretched out inside the belly of the LAV, his sleeping bag half-zipped and his rifle within easy reach. Across from him, the gunner had headphones in, the soft glow of a PSP screen casting weak light onto his face. The driver was up front in his compartment, probably still watching movies on his laptop. It was their downtime. They had an hour before they'd rotate into their shift on watch. No one wanted to sleep just yet. Not in that place. Not with the cold creeping in and the night pressing down like a weighted blanket. That's when it happened. There was a clank. Distinct. Metal on metal. Then a subtle shift in weight, like someone had stepped onto the top hull of the LAV. Chris and the gunner looked at each other. No words. Just shared breath and unspoken recognition. They both felt it, someone was up there. Moving. Slowly. They sat up. Sleep forgotten. Chris' fingers closed around the grip of his rifle, but he didn't lift it, not yet. Instead, he listened. Silence. No follow-up knock. No call from a sergeant. No opening hatch. Just stillness. Too still. After 30 seconds that stretched into eternity, Chris whispered, "Probably someone coming to tell us something. Shift change early, maybe." The gunner just nodded, eyes locked on the ceiling above them. One of the hatches should have opened by now. But nothing did. No creak of a latch, no boot scrape against the steel. No one spoke from above. Chris stood up and reached for the hatch handle above his bench. He paused with his hand on it, just for a second, long enough to let the unease set in. Then, with a practiced motion, he swung it open and poked his head into the cold night air. Nothing. The top of the LAV stretched out in the moonlight, empty. Quiet. From his elevated position, Chris could see the other vehicles in the perimeter circle, their silhouettes just barely catching the light. He could see the sleeping forms of his fellow soldiers, tucked into shallow ditches near their own vehicles. Still. Peaceful. But nobody was near his LAV. No one had climbed up. There was nowhere to hide. He climbed the rest of the way out, slowly, scanning from the turret platform. It gave him a commanding view of the whole camp, the circle of 20 vehicles spaced evenly around the dry riverbed, headlights off, weapons facing outward. Beyond them, nothing. Just pale, endless terrain that shimmered faintly under the moon. No figures. No movement. No wind. His breath caught in the back of his throat. The air was so dry it scratched on the way in. So thin it never quite filled your lungs. He climbed down, re-entered the LAV, and locked the hatch behind him. "See anything?" the gunner asked. Chris shook his head. "No. Nothing." The gunner didn't answer. He didn't need to. The expression on his face, somewhere between curiosity and dread, was answer enough. Chris looked toward the front, where the driver was still seated in his compartment. "You see anyone?" he called out. The driver didn't respond. "Not immediately." "Nothing," came the voice, finally. Flat. Not quite convincing. That was enough for now. Chris slid back into his seat and reached for his weapon, not to aim it, but just to feel the weight of it in his hands. Then he locked every hatch from the inside. They said nothing else for the rest of the hour, and when their shift came up, they rotated into duty like normal, watching, scanning again. No enemy movements. No errant civilians. Just the night, wide and empty. They slept a few hours later, but lightly. Fitfully. The next morning, they resumed the mission, moved to the first village on their sweep. Everything went as planned. No resistance. No contact. It wasn't until late that afternoon, when they had returned to the vehicles, that the driver spoke again. "I didn't want to say anything last night," he said over the intercom. didn't want to freak anyone out. Chris and the gunner exchanged glances. "What is it?" The driver paused. Then, I felt something. A beat of silence. Felt what? I was watching a movie. Earbuds in. Zoned out. And then I felt something. He hesitated again, longer this time. Fingers. On my head. From behind. Ran through my hair. Not hard, just a hand. Like someone brushing forward across my scalp. Chris' skin prickled. "You're serious?" "I thought it was one of you too," the driver said. "Maybe crawling up top to mess with me." But when I turned around, there was no one. Hatch was closed. Still locked. He said it calmly, but Chris could hear the edge in his voice. That metallic tremor of someone trying very hard not to sound crazy. They didn't talk much after that. Nobody joked. Nobody tried to rationalize. Because deep down, none of them could. They knew what they had heard. What they had felt. The LAV didn't feel right after that. It wasn't anything specific, just an air, a weight that settled into the compartment like a fourth crew member. Not hostile, exactly. Not angry. But present. And heavy. They wondered briefly if other soldiers had felt it before them. These vehicles didn't return home between deployments, they rotated. Passed from one unit to the next. Each one carrying the scars, stains, and, maybe, something else left behind. Chris never looked into it. Neither did the others. The idea of checking the history of the vehicle, seeing if anyone had died inside it, was too much. There were already enough ghosts in Kandahar without inviting new ones in. So they said nothing. They locked the hatches. They kept to their schedule. They never brought it up again. Not officially. But they never rode in that LAV the same way again. And every time Chris lay back on that bench, staring up at the closed hatch, he wondered what had been crawling on the outside of the vehicle that night. Or worse, if it had ever been outside at all. The next night was colder. That kind of cold that didn't come from the wind, but from the stillness. As if the desert had decided to stop breathing. As if the air itself had thickened with silence. Uriah had been reassigned to post hotel again. He didn't argue. Orders were orders. But as he climbed the metal stairs leading up the watchtower, he felt it, the same tension in his chest that he had the night before. Like something was waiting. Not out there in the dark, but here. Inside the perimeter. Inside the tower. This time, his partner wasn't the same as the night before. It was Williams, a buddy of his from their old unit. Solid guy. Straight shooter. Didn't believe in anything he couldn't hold in his hands. Which made him perfect. Uriah had told him about the shadows. About how they didn't move when they should have, and how they didn't disappear even under direct light. Williams had laughed. Called him tired. Called him imaginative. Called him spooked. But he agreed to switch for the night. "Just so you'll shut up about it," Head said, half grinning. They settled into the tower just after 0200. The radios were working. The floodlights were humming. The desert stretched out like a motionless ocean under the stars. And for the first hour, nothing happened. Uriah leaned on the parapet with a pair of binoculars, sweeping the terrain. William sat on a crate behind him, fiddling with his rifle, keeping an eye on their zone of fire. Idle chatter came across the side channel from Post Gulf, some Marines trading gossip or cracking weak jokes to keep awake. The usual. It all felt almost normal. But Post Hotel never stayed quiet. It was 0310 when Uriah first saw them again. Two shadows, standing exactly where the damage from the ANA truck crash scarred the HESCO wall. Same position. Same posture. One tall, one slightly shorter. Perfectly still. Uriah's throat went dry. He didn't say anything. Not right away. He didn't want to sound crazy, not again. He just turned and said, evenly, "Hey, Williams. You see that?" Williams stepped beside him and followed Uriah's line of sight. His eyes narrowed. His casual posture stiffened. A beat passed. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Another beat." "Then, that's weird." They stood in silence, side by side, just watching. The floodlights from the ANA compound were still shining, bright enough that any shadows cast by personnel should have been large, distorted, moving. But these weren't. These were sharp. Solid. Wrong. Williams raised his flashlight and clicked it on. The beam hit the figures squarely. They didn't disappear. "Still there," Uriah said. "Yeah," Williams muttered. "Still there." And then, slowly, the shadows began to move. But they didn't walk. Didn't sway or shift or change form. They just slid to the left, toward a wider shadow being cast by a parked ANA Humvee, as if being drawn into it. Not like men walking into cover. More like stains retreating into an old scar. "Jesus," Williams whispered. "There. Not real. That's not real." Uriah didn't answer. His mind was too busy trying to explain what he'd seen. Reflections? Illusions? Afterimages from night vision? But the binoculars confirmed it. The naked eye confirmed it. And now Williams had confirmed it too. They waited. Watched. But the shadows didn't return. The spot where they'd stood was now empty, just the dented wall, broken rock, and that gaping feeling that something had exited the scene but not the area. Williams sat back down slowly. His face looked different now, slack-jawed, quiet. The air of a man trying to reconcile something that couldn't be reconciled. He didn't say a word for a long time. Then came the sound. A single, metallic clunk. Not like something dropped. More like something hit the support beam of the tower. Hard. Uriah jerked upright. Williams was already standing. Both men froze. Again, clunk. Louder this time. The whole platform shuddered. The sound had come from below. Without speaking, Williams grabbed his rifle, checked the chamber, and started descending the steps. His boots thudded hollow on the metal stairs, echoing down into the dead silence. Uriah waited, radio in hand, watching the bottom edge of the tower for any movement. Minutes passed. Then Williams came back up, slower than had gone down. He looked pale. "There's no one," he said. "No tracks. No footprints in the dust. No animals. Nothing. Maybe the frame shifted?" Uriah offered weakly. Williams shook his head. "Nah. Not like that. Something hit it." They stood there for a long moment, unsure what to do. The side channel crackled, someone asking if Hotel had anything going on. Uriah pressed the mic button. Just a weird noise. Probably nothing. He let the lie settle into the frequency. Williams sank onto the crate again, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't like this post, man. I thought you were exaggerating." "I thought I was too," Uriah said. But it wasn't over. 10 minutes later, just as Williams was settling back into a light doze, the sound came again, this time from inside the structure. A low bang, not far below their feet, as if someone had slammed a heavy object into one of the steel joists under the platform. Williams bolted upright. "Okay, what the?" The radio hissed to life again. "Hotel, you got something going on over there?" Sounded like a bang. "We heard it from Delta." Uriah grabbed the mic again, steadying his voice. "We're checking it out now. Stand by." He looked at Williams. "We're not imagining this." Williams nodded slowly, his mouth pressed into a tight line. "Let's get someone else up here," Uriah said. At first, Kyle thought it was just the night playing tricks. But as he watched, the dust began to form the outline of a person. Legs. Arms. A head. A figure walking, no feet, no face, just the silhouette. It moved like it had weight, like it pressed down on the earth, but there was no sound. Just silence and that awful, grinding texture of dust swirling into something it had no business becoming. He watched it cross the dirt road, then vanish. Just, gone. By the time Kyle finished retelling it, everyone listening had gone quiet. Even the usual cynics had nothing to say. Because Kyle didn't do fear. But something about that dust figure had shaken him down to the marrow. And it wasn't just him. A few days later, reports started coming in about the machine guns. Not jams. Not mechanical failures. Just movement. Uncommanded. Untriggered. Mounted M2s that slowly pivoted on their own. As if someone, something, was grabbing the handles and shifting the weapon to scan the horizon. It only ever happened at night, and it never lasted more than a few seconds. But the pattern was undeniable. It was subtle enough to avoid drawing attention. But if you were standing near the gun at the time, or leaning on the tower's frame, you felt it. A subtle vibration. A pressure. Like hands brushing past your own. One Marine swore he felt a draft as the gun shifted, cold and sudden, like someone had stepped beside him. But when he turned, there was no one. Just the shadow of the weapon tracing a slow, deliberate arc across the night. He didn't say anything at first. Who would? It sounded absurd. But when two other guys in different towers brought it up over the radio, casually, like they were trying not to sound too serious, he realized it wasn't just him. It was spreading. The strangest part wasn't the machines or the shadows. It wasn't even the dust figures or the metal banging from below the towers. It was the consistency. Everyone was describing the same kind of thing. Unseen presence. Movement that shouldn't be possible. Apparitions that lingered for just long enough to be undeniable. And the timing. Always around the same hour. Always that stretch between 0300 and 0400. What the Afghan interpreters called Shaitan's Hour, the hour of wandering souls. That name started sticking. No one said it out loud during daylight. But once night fell, it floated across radios like a curse. That's when Uriah started asking questions. Not official ones. Not to command. Just quietly. In the smoke pit, between watch rotations, during chow line small talk. And what he learned only deepened the sense that something was wrong. One interpreter, a soft-spoken man in his 30s named Mahmoud, had been with the Marines through 4 deployments. Had seen more than most of them, and he spoke English better than some of the new guys. One night, as they sat watching the sky burn orange in the west, Uriah asked him about the ghost stories. Mahmoud didn't laugh. Instead, he nodded. There are many, he said. The land. It remembers. He spoke of places where entire patrols had vanished during the Soviet War. Where villagers swore they still heard gunfire in the mountains, battles that had ended decades ago. Screams in the wind. Silhouettes of men walking along ridgelines, then vanishing into rock. He told Uriah about his father's friend. Killed during a firefight with the Russians in the early 80s. Dead, buried, mourned. At first, Kyle thought it was just the night playing tricks. But as he watched, the dust began to form the outline of a person. Legs. Arms. A head. A figure walking, no feet, no face, just the silhouette. It moved like it had weight, like it pressed down on the earth, but there was no sound. Just silence and that awful, grinding texture of dust swirling into something it had no business becoming. He watched it cross the dirt road, then vanish. Just, gone. By the time Kyle finished retelling it, everyone listening had gone quiet. Even the usual cynics had nothing to say. Because Kyle didn't do fear. But something about that dust figure had shaken him down to the marrow. And it wasn't just him. A few days later, reports started coming in about the machine guns. Not jams. Not mechanical failures. Just movement. Uncommanded. Untriggered. Mounted M2s that slowly pivoted on their own. As if someone, something, was grabbing the handles and shifting the weapon to scan the horizon. It only ever happened at night, and it never lasted more than a few seconds. But the pattern was undeniable. It was subtle enough to avoid drawing attention. But if you were standing near the gun at the time, or leaning on the tower's frame, you felt it. A subtle vibration. A pressure. Like hands brushing past your own. One Marine swore he felt a draft as the gun shifted, cold and sudden, like someone had stepped beside him. But when he turned, there was no one. Just the shadow of the weapon tracing a slow, deliberate arc across the night. He didn't say anything at first. Who would? It sounded absurd. But when two other guys in different towers brought it up over the radio, casually, like they were trying not to sound too serious, he realized it wasn't just him. It was spreading. The strangest part wasn't the machines or the shadows. It wasn't even the dust figures or the metal banging from below the towers. It was the consistency. Everyone was describing the same kind of thing. Unseen presence. Movement that shouldn't be possible. Apparitions that lingered for just long enough to be undeniable. And the timing. Always around the same hour. Always that stretch between 0300 and 0400. What the Afghan interpreters called Shaitan's Hour, the hour of wandering souls. That name started sticking. No one said it out loud during daylight. But once night fell, it floated across radios like a curse. That's when Uriah started asking questions. Not official ones. Not to command. Just quietly. In the smoke pit, between watch rotations, during chow line small talk. And what he learned only deepened the sense that something was wrong. One interpreter, a soft-spoken man in his 30s named Mahmoud, had been with the Marines through 4 deployments. Had seen more than most of them, and he spoke English better than some of the new guys. One night, as they sat watching the sky burn orange in the west, Uriah asked him about the ghost stories. Mahmoud didn't laugh. Instead, he nodded. There are many, he said. The land. It remembers. He spoke of places where entire patrols had vanished during the Soviet War. Where villagers swore they still heard gunfire in the mountains, battles that had ended decades ago. Screams in the wind. Silhouettes of men walking along ridgelines, then vanishing into rock. He told Uriah about his father's friend. Killed during a firefight with the Russians in the early 80s. Dead, buried, mourned. And then, 3 nights later, he was seen walking home. He didn't speak. Just stepped inside the house, sat on the edge of the bed, and kissed his daughter on the forehead. Then he left. They found no footprints. No sign of entry. The daughter remembered the kiss like it had just happened. She is married now, Mahmoud said. But she still tells that story. Says she can feel his lips on her skin. Uriah didn't know what to say to that. But it stayed with him. Like everything else had started to. And then, just when he thought it might plateau, that maybe the weirdness would taper off, the latrine started knocking. The base had these portable toilets set in neat little rows on the outer edge of the sleeping quarters. Cheap plastic, baking hot during the day, freezing cold at night. No one liked using them. But now, they had another reason to stay away. At first, it was just a banging noise. Like someone kicking the side of the stall. Loud. Aggressive. But when guys checked, the row would be empty. No wind. No animals. No pranksters. Then came the lock turns. A few Marines started reporting that when they stepped inside and latched the door, it would suddenly unlock on its own. Sometimes twice. 3 times in a row. One guy, Corporal Dean, refused to use them after one night when the door unlatched, slowly swung open, and no one was there. He hadn't even had time to get his pants back up. Said he felt a breeze move through the stall. Cold. Centered. Deliberate. And then, just as he scrambled to his feet, the door slammed shut again. It had taken 3 days of convincing before Head used the toilet again. And even then, only in broad daylight. Word spread. Within a week, half the company was pissing behind the trucks instead. Uriah tried to rationalize all of it. Really, he did. He told himself it was fatigue. That maybe the base was just full of nervous energy. That these weren't ghosts, they were echoes. Trauma bleeding out into the sand. The land didn't forget. Maybe that included the fear, too. But no matter how many reasons he gave himself, the stories kept coming. And the worst part? He could feel it now. Every time he walked across the compound at night. That weight. Like someone watching him from behind the HESCO walls. Like something following just outside the ring of light. Not hostile. Not friendly. Just there. Waiting. Like it was watching all of them unravel, one story at a time. It was one thing to experience something you couldn't explain. It was another thing entirely to start piecing together that you weren't alone in it. After weeks of unexplained shadows, drifting shapes, and cold knocks that came from nowhere, Uriah reached a point where disbelief no longer served him. He wasn't trying to make sense of it in the traditional way anymore. Not with reason. Not with logic. Instead, he turned to the only thing that still worked out there in the dust and silence of Afghanistan: pattern recognition. In combat, pattern recognition keeps you alive. You don't need to know why the air feels heavier just before a mortar lands, you just need to act on it. You don't ask why a ridge feels wrong, or why the birds suddenly go quiet. You trust the twitch in your gut, the hairs that rise on your forearm. And now, that same instinct was telling Uriah there was more to these stories than coincidence. He started asking questions, not in briefings, not through official channels. That would only earn suspicion or get him slapped with a psych eval. No, Uriah's investigation happened in hushed conversations over smokes and whispered side-channel comms during night watch. It was informal, fragmented, and entirely fueled by gut feeling. But it was real. The first thing he did was start listening more deliberately. Not just to the stories, but to how they were told. Who hesitated? Who joked too quickly? Who refused to talk at all? Every shift change, every quiet lull during guard duty became a chance to collect pieces of a puzzle that no one else even admitted existed. He compiled them mentally. Stories of movement out of the corner of the eye. Figures glimpsed through night vision that disappeared when goggles came off. Radios switching channels on their own. Gun barrels drifting just slightly off target. Phantom footsteps on gravel that left no prints in the dust. Each one on its own could be dismissed. Together, they formed a kind of web. A perimeter. Not of logic, but of feeling. One night, Uriah approached Sergeant Blake. Blake had been on the base longer than most. A straight shooter. Didn't traffic in rumors. But he had this way of looking at the terrain sometimes, this quiet tension around his mouth, like he was holding something back. You ever see anything weird on shift? Uriah asked casually, lighting a cigarette beside the HESCO wall. Blake didn't answer immediately. He took a drag of his own cigarette, eyes scanning the horizon even though they both knew there was nothing there. You mean besides enemy fire? I mean weird, Uriah said. Stuff that doesn't make sense. Stuff that doesn't show up on a patrol report. Another pause. Then, I don't talk about that. Which was the same as saying yes. That was the thing Uriah was starting to learn, nobody wanted to admit what they'd seen. But the longer he stayed, the clearer it became, they all had stories. They just buried them. There was the corporal from 3rd Squad who said he'd stopped using the mirrors in the latrine at night. Claimed more than once had seen someone standing behind him, a dark figure just past his shoulder, only to turn and find no one there. At first, he'd chalked it up to nerves. Deployment stress. The mind playing tricks. But the 3rd time it happened, he started shaving in the dark. There was the mechanic who swore he saw someone crouched under a transport truck, wearing boots but no shadow, then watched that figure vanish as he stepped closer. He didn't report it. Just walked away, pale and shaking, and spent the next 2 nights sleeping in his Humvee. And then there was Jenkins. Uriah found Jenkins behind the comms tent one night, chain-smoking and muttering to himself. He was a reservist, a radio operator, calm and methodical. But something had changed in him. His eyes looked glassy, like they were fixed on a distance no one else could see. "I heard something," Jenkins said before Uriah could even ask. "On the comms. My headset wasn't even plugged in all the way. Just static at first, and then." He trailed off, pressing a hand over his mouth like he wasn't sure he should go on. Uriah waited. It said my name. Now, in a place like that, hearing your name in the middle of the night, even just once, was enough to twist something loose in your chest. But hearing it through an unplugged headset? That was something else entirely. Jenkins swore it came through like a whisper. Close. Wet. Like someone speaking through water. Not my call sign, he clarified. My actual name. My real name. The one I haven't heard anyone use in months. He paused again. And then it laughed. Not loud. Just. Enough. Uriah didn't laugh. Didn't even blink. He just nodded and said, "Yeah. I believe you." Because he did. More and more, it felt like there was something embedded in the land, something deeper than superstition. Afghanistan wasn't just a war zone. It was a graveyard. A place soaked in violence and memory. From Alexander the Great to the British Empire, from Soviet tanks to US drones, it was all the same. Layer upon layer of blood and ash and things left behind. Maybe it wasn't ghosts. Maybe it wasn't spirits. Maybe it was something older. Something without a name. Something that fed off the energy of the living and the dying, coiling itself around those moments that teetered between the rational and the impossible. Uriah began mapping it out in his head. The sightings. The patterns. He sketched crude layouts on the backs of mailboxes during his downtime, circling posts and incidents, noting the proximity of strange events to former battlefield sites or areas hit hardest during previous rotations. The majority clustered around 3 locations: Post Hotel, the old mortar pit, and the burned-out ANA barracks on the east end of the base. Every Marine who'd stood watch at those points had at least one strange experience. Some had multiple. But none of it was official. There were no reports. No documentation. Just whispers traded like contraband. He tried to dig deeper. He spoke to interpreters who had worked with Soviet units during the 80s. One of them, an older man named Farid, had a scar that ran from his cheek to his collarbone and a calmness that bordered on eerie. Uriah caught him smoking outside the supply tent and asked if he'd ever heard of things on base. Things that didn't belong. Farid looked at him with eyes like polished coal. "We have many stories," he said. "But this place. It's not just stories. It's ground memory. The earth here remembers every scream, every death, every betrayal. It does not forget." "Do you believe in ghosts?" Uriah asked. Farid exhaled smoke slowly. "No," he said. "Ghosts are what you have in the West. Spirits with faces. Stories with endings. This is something else. This is unfinished. It does not speak your name because it knows you. It speaks it because it is still deciding what you are. That line stuck with Uriah for days. It is still deciding what you are. He started paying closer attention to when the incidents occurred. The majority clustered between 0300 and 0400 hours. Not midnight. Not right after dusk. Always that narrow window just before dawn. He remembered something one of the Afghan guards had said in passing, the death hour, they called it. The time when souls wandered between worlds, looking for warmth, for bodies, for memory. Around this time, Uriah started journaling again. Just small notes. Observations. Incidents. Things he didn't trust to memory anymore. He wrote in a tiny green notebook he kept inside his flak vest. He never let it out of his sight. One night, after hearing yet another set of footsteps on the metal stairwell of Post Delta, where no one ever appeared, he returned to his tent and opened the notebook to log the time. But the page was already marked. One line, scrawled in handwriting that wasn't his. You are not alone. He closed the notebook slowly. His hands were cold. Too cold. He didn't tell anyone. Didn't need to. From that night forward, he stopped trying to investigate. Not actively. Not outwardly. He realized the same thing every other soldier who had experienced something strange came to understand eventually, that the deeper you looked, the closer it came. And whatever it was, he didn't want to give it a reason to follow him home. It was supposed to be another quiet shift. Nothing on the schedule. No rotations. No patrols. Just another long night at the edge of the world, where nothing moved but the wind and time crawled so slowly you could feel your bones counting it down. Uriah had returned to Post Delta after a few weeks of strange encounters. It wasn't that he felt safe there, it was just less unsafe. Fewer stories. No shadows that glided. No footsteps on the stairs. Just dust and distance. That night, it was his turn to take the first half of the shift while his partner, Alvarez, got some sleep on the cot behind the comm stack. The wind had died down around 0200. A kind of breathless silence filled the space, not unfamiliar in the Afghan desert but somehow heavier that night. As if the atmosphere itself was holding something back. Uriah stood behind the mounted M240B, sweeping the horizon out of habit more than anticipation. His NVGs painted the world in shades of green static. Nothing moved out there. Not the fences. Not the trash snagged in the barbed wire. Not the earth. But then, there was a flicker. Not movement. Not a figure. Just a brief distortion in the field of vision. A smudge, like a glitch in the goggles. He had just them. Tapped the side. But everything looked normal again. He reached for his logbook, something had started doing ever since the encounters had begun. Small notations, short entries, time, temperature, emotional state. It helped him feel grounded. Real. Anchored. He glanced at his watch, 3:11. When he looked back up, there it was again. Not a flicker this time. A person. Walking just beyond the far perimeter fence. Too far to make out features, but close enough to be real. Upright. Human-shaped. Moving at a deliberate pace along the wire. Uriah lowered the NVGs and blinked into the natural darkness. Gone. He raised them again. The figure was still there. Pacing. And then, it stopped. Turned. Faced him. It was too far to make out any expression, but something about the posture was unmistakable. It wasn't looking around, it was looking at him. Directly. Uriah felt something cold settle into his gut. He reached for the radio handset, thumb hovering over the push-to-talk. But before he could key it, the figure vanished. Not faded. Not walked away. Just, gone. Like someone had cut it from the frame. He stared. Waited. Then checked the time again. 3:15. Of course. The moment passed. The night crept on. By 0400, the desert was still. And that's when the radio clicked. Not static. Not a call from another tower. Just a click. A burst of soft white noise, followed by something that made the hairs on the back of Uriah's neck lift like blades of grass in a storm. Breathing. Not his. Not Alvarez's. A third, low, rasping breath. Close to the mic, too close. He froze. The sound faded. A whisper of breath. And then, unmistakably, a voice. It didn't say his call sign. It didn't say a name. It said a word. Home. The voice was hoarse. Genderless. Just one word. Then silence. Alvarez stirred behind him, coughing once and sitting up. Uriah didn't mention it. Not yet. Because his mind was somewhere else now. Home. Why that word? Why now? He didn't sleep when his shift ended. Instead, when the sun rose and the base slowly returned to life, he made his way across the gravel to the old IT hut, where comms and data from past rotations were archived on ruggedized hard drives. He told the tech there he was looking for archived recordings, unclassified chatter, something from a previous watchtower to help with a training demo. The guy didn't question it. Just handed him a labeled drive and said, "Good luck. It's all a mess." Uriah took it back to his tent and plugged it into his battered laptop. What he found shouldn't have existed. There were recordings, hundreds, of ambient tower audio logs, mostly used to document radio check-ins. Most were silence, static, occasional clipped commands. But one stood out. The file name was cryptic. Just a string of numbers. But the timestamp caught his eye. 0315. He hit play. Static. Then breathing. And then. "You're not supposed to be here." It was faint, warbled. But clear enough. Another breath. "Go back." Uriah hit pause, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. He double-checked the file's metadata. It was from a post near the FOB's old mortar pit. Dated 2 years before his current deployment. He checked another file. Another tower. Another night. Same time. More breathing. "He's watching you." The voice wasn't always the same. Sometimes male. Sometimes higher pitched. But always quiet. Always right at the edge of the mic. Always around 0315. Always the same message. "Go back. You're not supposed to be here." He pulled more files. Dozens. Cross-referenced them with old incident logs. Tower complaints. Night shift rotations. He found it. An entry, buried deep in a logbook from a different company rotation. One line written in shaky handwriting, almost scratched into the page. "I heard it again. It's the same voice from last year. Why does it know my name?" No follow-up. No incident report. No response. That was the twist. Not that the strange events were happening now. But that they'd always been happening. Uriah stared at his laptop screen as the sun began to rise outside, its pale orange light creeping up the canvas wall of his tent. He thought about the shadows. The dust figure. The mounted guns that turned without cause. The footsteps on stairs that led to empty air. The breathing in the comms. He thought about the stories. Not just from his deployment, but the ones passed down. The ones people pretended were jokes. The ones people started to tell, then stopped. And now he realized, it wasn't just this rotation. It wasn't just his team. This had been going on for years. Maybe decades. He remembered what Mahmoud had said. The earth does not forget. That was the truth hiding underneath all of it. This wasn't a haunting. Not in the Western sense. There was no singular ghost. No isolated event. No incident to investigate. This was something collective. Something systemic. The land held memory like wounds held infection, hidden under the skin until pressure made it surface. And Uriah, like so many before him, had simply wandered into one of its fever dreams. The figure in the goggles. The voice on the radio. The shadows that slid like spilled oil. They weren't haunting him. They weren't even choosing him. They were simply there. Like radiation. Background. Unseen until you stepped into it. He sat back, notebook in his lap, mind spinning with the quiet horror of realization. This wasn't a story that ended. It didn't resolve. There was no final night. No big confrontation. There was only proximity. And the cold truth that once you'd heard the voice, once you'd seen the figure, you carried it with you. Even if you left the desert. Even if you crossed an ocean. Even if you buried the memories deep. Because that was the twist. You don't leave it behind. It leaves something behind in you. You start to piece it together, not all at once, but gradually, like fog rolling back just enough to glimpse the road you've been walking the whole time. At some point, Uriah stopped asking what happened and started asking why. Why had so many different people, different units, different backgrounds, different times, experienced the same strange phenomena? Why were the voices always around 3:15 a.m.? Why the shadows, the whispers, the mechanical malfunctions that never made it into any official report? It couldn't be coincidence. Not anymore. So, he began to reconstruct the timeline. Not just his own experiences, but everyone's. He laid them out mentally like a battlefield map: Chris and the LAV incident. Sector SOS and the ghost boy only visible through NVGs, Kyle and the dust figure pacing beneath the wire. Uriah and the shadows at Post Hotel. Jenkins with the breathing in the headset. The girl in white seen walking barefoot past the fence. The whisper of his name through static. And threaded through all of it, one constant. Presence. Not noise. Not chaos. Not aggression. Just presence. Whatever it wasn't following a linear narrative. It didn't seem interested in scaring them out of the region, or harming anyone directly. It didn't behave like something with intent. It behaved like a pattern. A residue. That's when it hit him. Maybe it wasn't a ghost, not in the storybook sense. Maybe it wasn't even a who. Maybe it was a what. A condition. Something the land carried. Like radiation. Like mold spores. Invisible but transferable. The more time you spent around it, the deeper it soaked in. It latched onto proximity, not belief. It didn't care if you believed in it. It only cared if you were there. The Afghan interpreters had said as much. They didn't talk about spirits or haunts. They talked about the land being imprinted, like trauma had left an emotional fingerprint on the desert floor, the way a bomb blast leaves heat in concrete long after the explosion fades. Mahmoud called it ground memory. That stuck with Uriah more than anything else. Because that idea made sense in a place like Afghanistan, a country where empires came to die and ghosts didn't have faces or names. They were just the leftovers. And war, after all, is messy. You don't always bury the bodies right away. You don't always clear the field before the next fight begins. Sometimes, it all just layers. One tragedy on top of another. One generation's wounds bleeding into the next. And if memory lives anywhere, it's in repetition. Uriah thought back to all the old FOB stories he'd heard, the shadows that walked the wire at COP Spurwan Gar, the whispering voices in the barracks at Firebase Blessing, the figures seen pacing rooftops during moonless nights in Khost province. These were different bases. Different wars. Different years. But the stories? Identical. The same pacing figures. The same 3 a.m. hour. The same sensation of being watched, not attacked, not threatened, just observed. As though something on the other side of reality had taken notice and decided to stand close enough for breath to pass between you. That was the true shape of it. Whatever it was, it didn't behave like an enemy. It didn't behave like something tactical. It behaved like something aware. And maybe, Uriah thought, maybe it wasn't interested in hurting them. Maybe it was just waiting. Waiting for someone to see it. To recognize it. To acknowledge that after years of blood and fire, something had grown here that wasn't man-made. That couldn't be killed. That wasn't trying to speak so much as echo. He thought again about the voice in the radio. Not a threat. Just one word, home. It didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a statement of fact. This was its home. The fire bases. The towers. The dust. The wreckage. The fear. It didn't haunt soldiers. It adopted them. The revelation made Uriah sit in silence for a long time the night it finally landed. He sat on the stairs of Post Delta, helmet in his lap, watching the moon climb the ridgeline like a slow, indifferent eye. The desert lay still around him, vast, uncaring, quiet in a way that no city could ever replicate. And yet, in that silence, he felt the pressure of presence more clearly than ever. The ghost, if you could call it that, wasn't in any one place. It was in every place. It was a system. A pattern. A set of rules they didn't understand but had stumbled into by doing what soldiers always do, showing up, digging in, and trying to survive. Maybe it had always been this way. Maybe some places weren't meant to be lived in. Maybe they were never meant to be occupied. Maybe they were meant to be remembered. And Uriah understood then, they hadn't been investigating a mystery. They'd been living inside it. And the thing no one wanted to admit was that it didn't care if you left. Because once you'd seen it, really seen it, it came with you. In dreams. In reflections. In long silences between breaths where you swear someone else is in the room. Not to hurt. Not to follow. But to remain. Because memory doesn't die. It just changes shape. And some places, especially the ones soaked in blood and repetition, don't let go. They hold on. Quietly. Patiently. Like dust in your lungs. Like sand in your boots, years after you've come home. Uriah didn't try to explain this to anyone. He didn't write a report. Didn't call it in. Didn't mention it over radio. But the next morning, he packed his notebook and burned it. Not out of fear. Out of understanding. You don't carry the desert with you unless you want it to follow. And some memories. Some presences. Are better left buried beneath the dust they came from. The trouble with what they saw, what they felt, wasn't that it was unbelievable. It was that it refused to be forgotten. Uriah had done what he could to distance himself from it. Had moved posts, pulled himself from the watchtower rotations that had rattled him the most. Had stopped writing things down. Burned the journal. Kept quiet. Kept moving. Stayed busy. But the silence only got louder. The rational mind always tries to find footing. And Uriah tried. 4 weeks. He tried telling himself it was sleep deprivation. Stress. Environmental noise. Maybe a chemical residue in the old equipment or power hum from the diesel generators. He tried blaming trauma. Hallucinations. Shared delusion. He even went to the corpsman and asked for sleep aids. Said he was having trouble staying down during rest cycles. They gave him melatonin and a vague look of concern, but nobody asked too many questions. Everyone was fried, after all. Everyone looked like ghosts under the halogen lights. But it wasn't sleep deprivation. Because he was getting more sleep now. But the dreams, those started only after the sightings stopped. It was always the same. The stairs at Post Hotel. The whisper of something behind him. The shape of a figure at the bottom. Just out of frame. Just far enough that he could never see its face, but close enough that he felt its presence like breath against skin. Every time, he would wake up gasping. The tent pitch black. His cot soaked with sweat. No one talked about it anymore, and that was worse than the stories themselves. It had become taboo. At first, there had been muttered conversations during watch rotations. Jokes. Nervous laughter. But now, it was silence. A silence laced with that brittle edge of fear people don't want to admit. Like if they kept their heads down and mouths shut, maybe it would pass over them. Maybe it would forget they were there. But it didn't. One morning, Uriah caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the side mirror of a Humvee. He didn't recognize the man staring back. Skin pale. Eyes ringed in red. Cheekbones sharp with sleep loss. He looked like he'd been underwater for weeks. He stepped back. And for a moment, just a split second, he thought he saw something behind him. He spun. No one. Just the whisper of canvas in the wind. He started avoiding his own reflection after that. Then came the urinalysis. It wasn't the drug test itself, it was why they did it. 3 of them were pulled in. All of them had been part of the tower rotations during the worst nights. All of them had either seen something or heard someone who shouldn't be there. All of them had talked about it, even in passing. The tests came back clean, of course. But the message was clear. They weren't being screened. They were being watched. Like Command had heard the rumors. Heard the stories. And instead of asking for details, they were looking for a reason to write it all off. Discredit the witnesses. Call it stress. Substance abuse. Anything but what it actually was. A pattern. The night after the test, Uriah sat outside the tents by himself, watching the stars. He tried to convince himself none of it mattered. That he could go back to being the man he was before Post Hotel. Before the breathing on the radio. Before the figure said home. But something inside him had cracked. And no amount of rationalization would glue it shut. He saw Jenkins again. The radio operator had heard his name whispered through the comms. He was sitting alone, chain-smoking with trembling fingers. Uriah sat beside him without a word. Minutes passed. Then Jenkins spoke. I left the radio on again last night. Uriah didn't answer. Jenkins exhaled a slow breath. It didn't say anything this time. Just breathing. For a long time. Like it was waiting for me to speak first. That silence between them wasn't empty. It was dense. Full of all the things neither of them could put into words. Eventually, Jenkins ground the cigarette out on the ground and stood up. You ever feel like we're the ghosts? He asked. Then he walked off. Uriah sat with that question long after the man was gone. Later that week, another Marine, Callahan, had a breakdown during a briefing. He stood up mid-sentence, interrupted the squad leader, and started shouting about something being in his tent. Said it watched him sleep. Said it breathed on his face. He was restrained. Sent for evaluation. No one spoke his name after that. They called it combat stress. Everyone nodded. Everyone moved on. But Uriah knew better. He remembered the sound Callahan made as they hauled him away, how it wasn't panic exactly. It was grief. Like something had broken loose inside him that couldn't be put back. And still, the war went on. The trucks kept rolling. The briefings kept happening. The desert kept swallowing every echo they left behind. Uriah started to detach. He went through the motions, PT, weapons checks, shift logs, but he felt hollow. Like his body was there, but something essential had stepped a few inches to the left. Always nearby. Always watching. But never quite with him. His squad started noticing. "You good?" one of them asked one morning. "Just tired," Uriah lied. But it wasn't just fatigue. It was erosion. A slow, grinding kind. The kind that happens when you see too much, and no one believes you. When the only people who do believe are just as cracked and exhausted as you are. And worst of all, he started to question himself. What if it was just stress? What if none of it was real? What if he wanted it to be real, because the alternative was worse? That it was all just in his head? That he was alone in this? He stood outside Post Delta one night, watching the moon rise, and whispered aloud. "Did I make you up?" The wind didn't answer. But something inside him shifted. Because the truth was, it didn't matter anymore. Real or not, imagined or shared, the damage had been done. The breakdown wasn't sudden. It came in whispers. A silence in the barracks that felt too quiet. A flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. A familiar voice in a dream that asked, "Are you still there?" He stopped writing. Stopped reaching out. Stopped fighting it. Because eventually, you stop asking what's real and start asking what will let you sleep at night. And if that means pretending it was all in your head, then so be it. But deep down, he knew. Whatever had touched them out there, it never let go. Some things don't end when you leave. Uriah had been back stateside for months. His deployment gear stashed in the attic, the desert dust rinsed out of his boots, the uniform cleaned and pressed for inspections that no longer carried the same weight. His new job was simple, structured, routine. Patrol the quiet streets of a mid-sized American city, take reports, respond to calls, stay visible, stay present. And yet, some nights, the silence here felt exactly like it did over there. Not quiet in the peaceful sense. Quiet in the wrong sense. The kind that hummed under your skin. Like something was being held back just behind the drywall, just beneath the sidewalk. It followed him home in small ways. At first, it was just sleep. Or the lack of it. Waking every morning between 3 and 4, eyes wide, heart drumming in his chest, the memory of something unspeakable still clinging to the edges of his dreams like wet ash. He'd sit up in bed, drenched in sweat, the room pitch black and cold no matter how high the thermostat was set. Sometimes he swore he could still hear the metallic thump of boots on the stairs. But there were no towers here. No sandbag perimeters. No Afghan wind whispering through rusted coils of wire. Just the walls of his home. Just silence. He told himself it was memory. A symptom. Something that would wear off with time. But then there were the shoes. It started with his wife's sneakers, perfectly normal pairs placed neatly under the bed before sleep, and then found the next morning, rearranged. Always the same way. Crossed at the ankles. Toes pointing outward. Set directly in the center of the bedroom doorway, forming a kind of cross. She thought it was the dogs at first. But the dogs were always asleep, curled up on the couch, unbothered. Then it happened again. And again. And Uriah knew, had seen this before. That arrangement. That shape. It wasn't random. It felt ritualistic. Symbolic. Like something was trying to say, "I'm here. I made it back, too." He tried not to mention it. Tried not to acknowledge it. Because in the smoke pit, back at Dwyer, that had been the quiet rule, the moment you said it out loud, the moment you recognized it, it got stronger. Like attention fed it. Like belief made it real. So he kept quiet. Until the night he was brushing his teeth and saw, just for an instant, a shape behind him in the mirror. Not a reflection. Not a trick of the light. Just a figure. Watching. Still. It was gone in less than a second. But he didn't finish brushing. Didn't spit. Just turned off the light and walked out of the bathroom with the kind of calm that hides panic. He told himself he was tired. Told himself it was stress. Told himself anything but the truth he already knew. The desert doesn't let go. It doesn't fade. It doesn't forgive. And if you see it, really see it, it carries you with it like a shadow stitched to your heels. He stopped using mirrors at night. He unplugged his radio scanner. He avoided reflections in storefront windows. But it didn't matter. Because it wasn't about fear anymore. It was about recognition. He began to understand that what he, and all the others, had seen out there was never just about ghosts. It wasn't about haunting. It was about residue. Trauma pressed into dirt and metal and silence. Not just from his war, but all the wars. From Soviet tanks and tribal clashes, from gunpowder and blade, from centuries of blood soaking into the same ground again and again until the ground itself started whispering back. And he had heard it. He knew it. And that made him part of it. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't even cruel. It was just there. Watching. Waiting. A presence without a face. A memory with no source. Sometimes, when he walks the night shift alone and the streets are still, he hears a voice, not spoken, not audible, but implied, that simply says, "You remember, don't you?" And he nods. Silently. Because he does. Because some things don't leave. Some things stay. And all you can do is try to live alongside them. There's no neat bow to tie around it. No last night on base where it all clicked into place, no climactic confrontation where someone came face to face with the thing that haunted them. That's not how it worked. That's not how it ever worked. Instead, it just stopped. No final message. No goodbye. Just a quiet stretch of nights where nothing strange happened. The footsteps on the stairs didn't come back. The radio stayed silent. The shadows outside the wire held their shape and didn't move. Everything was still. Too still. And for a moment, that silence felt like a relief. Like maybe it had finally burned itself out, whatever it was. Maybe the desert had grown tired of them. Or maybe it had found someone else. But even as things went quiet, the fear didn't leave. It just changed. It became something deeper. Quieter. The fear of what hadn't happened. The fear of what still might. Uriah packed up his gear like everyone else when it was time to rotate home. Same process. Same forms. Same inspections. He threw his uniform into a duffel, zipped up the past 10 months like a cheap bag, and boarded a plane that hung over the same sand that had swallowed pieces of him he'd never get back. The sky over the runway was empty that morning. No strange winds. No silhouettes on the ridges. No final signs. But the moment the wheels left the tarmac, he felt it. That weight. Like he was leaving something unfinished. Or worse, like something wasn't being left behind. He didn't speak about it for months. There's a silence you carry after things like this. A silence no one wants to poke at. People ask how the deployment was, and you give them the stock answers. Hard, but I'm home. Glad to be back. Could have been worse. You don't mention the cold breath on the back of your neck at 3 a.m. You don't talk about dust that moves like it remembers things. You definitely don't talk about the voice on the radio that whispered home. But you remember. And it remembers you. Sometimes, you'll be driving at night, and a stretch of road will feel too quiet, and your body will brace like it's still out there, like it expects the tower to groan underfoot or the ground to stir with something unseen. Sometimes, you'll hear static bleed through a playlist on your car radio, and you'll glance at the clock, and it'll read 3:15 a.m., and you'll feel your throat tighten. And sometimes, when you're finally starting to believe it's behind you, you'll catch the shape of something just outside your window, reflected in the blackness of glass. Just watching. The truth is, none of them ever figured out what it was. Not Uriah. Not Jenkins. Not Chris, not Sector SOS. Not any of the men who'd stood out there night after night and come back with that haunted, distant stare. There were theories. Always theories. Maybe it was a trick of trauma. A psychic scar etched into the land, looping itself into those unlucky enough to step inside it. Maybe it was a product of the war, so many deaths compressed into the same space that reality started to thin. Or maybe it wasn't about war at all. Maybe it had been there long before any boots touched sand. Maybe it was the land. But no one had answers. Only stories. And the most chilling part? The stories keep happening. You'll find them scattered in forums. Hushed threads in veteran spaces. Comments buried under YouTube videos. Stories that follow the same arc, the quiet steps, the wrong-shaped shadows, the voices that whisper at night but say nothing you want to hear. They never conclude. They never resolve. They always stop abruptly, like the storyteller is still living in it, still waking up in the dark, still afraid of mirrors, still refusing to speak certain names aloud. Because some things don't want to be solved. Some things exist to linger. That's what haunts Uriah the most now, not what he saw, but what he didn't. The unfinished. The unanswered. The feeling that something still hasn't shown itself fully. That what they experienced was only the edge of something deeper. Something ancient. Something that doesn't care about understanding. That only wants to be witnessed. And maybe that's the point. Maybe some stories aren't meant to end. Maybe they're meant to echo. So if you ever find yourself standing alone in the dark, eyes adjusting, heart racing, ears straining for a sound you can't name, and you feel something watching from just beyond the edge of what's explainable, don't ask if it's real. Ask if it's remembered you.